Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to talk about the growth of the People's Republic of China, especially under Chairman Mao. And we're going to look at the various policies that were pushed and how the People's Republic of China more or less became at least the beginnings of the country we know today. So here's our objectives for today. We'll take a moment and talk a little bit about the process in which Communist China developed itself. And as always, keep in mind the similarities and differences to other communist countries like the Soviet Union. So, Mao was, of course, the undisputed leader of the Communist Party in the aftermath of the takeover of the People's Republic of China. But Mao did a number of different things to consolidate his power in the early years, most famously the Five Anti campaign. This was ostensibly a campaign to try to get rid of bribery and corruption within the Communist Party, but in reality, it really allowed Mao to target his political enemies, marginalize them, discredit them, and consolidate his own hold on power. This is one of the trends that we've seen many times throughout Chinese history is the use of anti-corruption campaigns to solidify and centralize power in the hands of the party and in the hands of the party leader. This is not to say that there was not corruption and that these people were not targeted for potentially good reasons, but the end effect of this is generally, again, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party consolidating more power in their hands as their opponents are worried about their potential corruption or fake corruption charges being brought against them. Here's Mao describing his policies and why he supports this sort of dictatorial regime and the whole idea of the people's democratic dictatorship. So take a moment, pause, and read, and let's move forward. In the end, relations with the Soviet Union really break down after the death of Stalin. Despite Stalin's poor treatment of Mao and Stalin never truly treating Mao as an equal, during the era of Stalin there were close relations between the two sides. But once Khrushchev takes over, China and Russia are going to split and go their separate ways. They're no longer going to provide a unified communist front against the United States, despite American rhetoric to the contrary. And we're really going to see some pretty severe tensions develop between these two countries over a whole host of different issues. One of the pieces here, of course, as we talked about, is Khrushchev's distancing himself from Stalin. As Khrushchev attempts to distance himself from Stalin, Mao sees the potential that one day he might be distanced from and that new communist leaders might try to limit and downplay his influence over the whole communist revolution. And so he really dislikes what he calls revisionism from Khrushchev. And Khrushchev's failure to share nuclear weapons with China also creates tensions. And so, for both of those reasons, China and Russia break from each other and enter into a period of more tension than cooperation. Mao is going to push massive land reform. Previously, they had attempted to give land to the peasants, but in the aftermath of this, what we're going to see is the rise of collective farming, similarly to what we saw under Stalin in the aftermath of the Soviet Union. Chinese peasants, as opposed to each owning their own plots of land, are going to work communal plots of land, eat in communal mess halls, and live this sort of perfect communist utopian lifestyle, pushing forth this sort of vision of unified community. We're also going to see a campaign for education during this time period. This is incredibly important because literacy was often out of reach for the average Chinese peasant throughout most Chinese history. So, pushing schools in order to teach people how to read, especially the new simplified Chinese that had developed as part of the New China movement. We see an increase in universities and pushing people into higher education in order to become more, get a larger population of educated professionals in order to increase innovation, efficiency, and the growth of new industries. And we're going to see a growth in acceptance of medicine and medical technologies, pushing for vaccination campaigns, public health campaigns, and other things in order to improve the lives of the Chinese people. And so the Chinese Communist Party played a central role in trying to elevate the Chinese peasantry to statuses that they've really never seen at any point throughout most of Chinese history. So for the common people, the Chinese Communist Party was generally doing good things and attempting to improve their lives. Mao even attempted to open up the censorship rules and the government to some extent through what's called the 100 Flowers campaign. The people in China were, after this first 5-year plan, were encouraged to write honest opinions and even provide criticism of government officials, putting up the sort of big character posters that Chinese society is known for. And so there was this real encouraging to, provide alternatives, provide criticism, and provide legitimate feedback to the government. Unfortunately, as generally happens within, especially the Chinese Communist Party, people were too critical, and it was decided that that the Chinese government had to crack down on this. And so people, especially academics and other sort of out groups within Chinese society, were generally targeted, were then persecuted for their opinions, and it was used as a way to sort of eliminate and marginalize enemies of the party, increasingly solidifying and consolidating the power of the Chinese Communist Party over Chinese government and society. So I don't think the 100 Flowers campaign was necessarily a planned trap by the Chinese Communist Party to get their critics to reveal themselves. But I think that Mao was surprised by, to some degree, the level of the criticism of his policies, and then, being famously thin skinned, cracked down. And the result in the end was the same. Anyone who criticized the Chinese government was, sent down to work in the fields, subjected to struggle sessions, and in general marginalized. The second 5 year plan, or the Great Leap Forward, was an attempt to not only expand China's agricultural production, but also expand their heavy industry. Chinese people were encouraged to, create backyard steel smelting furnaces in order to create and increase steel production, and use a portion of their time to help improve heavy industry within the Chinese economy. This Great Leap Forward, unfortunately, was a disaster, leading to the collapse of both the agricultural production and also creating a bunch of not super useful steel, because of course you've got a bunch of people who don't know how to create steel smelting steel in their backyards, as John Green pointed out. So here's a description of the conditions during the Great Leap Forward. Take a moment to pause and read. What's noteworthy here is we don't see much criticism of Chairman Mao and the party. Generally, local officials are blamed for this, with the idea that Chairman Mao would step in and save them from all of this plight. And Mao, generally, when he traveled around, party officials were afraid to tell him anything that was going wrong with the Great Leap Forward, lest they be accused of revisionism or anti-communist activities or secret capitalism. And so, to some degree, Mao was isolated from the effects of this and was just shown, happy peasants having enough to eat and, smelting steel in their blast furnaces in their backyard. Also, the anti-pest campaigns represent some of the problems with the over-planning of the Chinese Communist Party. There was a concern that pests were responsible for the food shortages, and so there was a campaign, for example, to get people to go out and exterminate sparrows and other pests, believing that the sparrows were eating the grain. Unfortunately, in the aftermath of this, it turned out that the sparrows were generally eating grasshoppers who were eating the grain, and the increase in the amount of insects made the food problem worse. And so this, in the end, reveals some problems with the level of granular planning involved in these sort of centralized command economy decisions, and created massive problems here. In the end, Peng Dehuai did stand up and criticize Mao for the Great Leap Forward, but he was then marginalized. We hopefully remember Peng Dehuai as one of the leaders of the Chinese Volunteer Army in the Korean War, as well as a hero of the Chinese Civil War for the Communists. So Peng Dehuai was marginalized, was struggled, and was somewhat exiled from party life as a result of his criticisms of Mao. In general, the economy was brought back by a combination of Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai. These two guys were able to institute some incentives in order to get the economy going again, were able to sort of limit some of the damaging top-down policies that led to these problems. And they, after the famine subsided, Chinese society to some degree returned to normal. Mao was very concerned about this, especially the bringing in of incentives and some pieces of capitalism. And so these capitalist roaders, as he called them, the people taking the capitalist road, were the next targets of Mao. And he was worried that he was going to be marginalized within the party, and that Deng and Zhou were going to be sort of elevated as the saviors of the people. And so this led to the kicking off of the Cultural Revolution. Mao attempted to seize even more control over the party and basically ensure that anyone who presented any threat to him would be marginalized, and that Chinese society would be remade in his perfect communist image, running a campaign of destruction against the four olds: old custom, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Unfortunately, for historians, this was an absolute disaster because it led to the substantial destruction of a lot of Chinese cultural history, religious history, historical sites, things like that. Mao kicked off the Cultural Revolution with his famous big character poster, encouraging people to bombard the headquarters and then travel around, creating revolution and ensuring that the spirit of communist revolution would be strong within Chinese society. Here's the famous essay, Ignite the Cultural Revolution. So take a moment, pause, read. Clearly see the attempts to defend Mao Zedong thought, defend the dictatorship of the proletariat, centralize power within Mao, and target the, quote, enemies of the party, basically anyone who is opposing Mao and his ideas. In the end, a lot of this was carried out by the group that would become known as the Gang of Four, most famously Jiang Qing, who was Mao's wife at the time. She would further the Cultural Revolution by the creation of a bunch of really interesting operas presenting sort of idealized versions of the Civil War, as well as sort of the theoretical utopia of Chinese communism. So they're interesting. If you're interested in diving into Chinese socialist realism, and especially socialist realism and opera, take a moment, dive in, and explore that, because that's a fascinating whole field of study. The attempts to destroy the Four Olds really had a devastating effect on Chinese society. In general, the attacks on traditional religion did the same thing that the Soviets' attempts to secularize their society did. Generally, people didn't stop practicing their religion. The religious practices simply went underground, and they weren't doing it in public again. Educated youth sent down to the countryside was not super effective, and marginalized a whole group of really promising Chinese individuals. This idea that these intellectually successful youth needed to go learn from the peasants really led to the stymieing of innovation within Chinese society, and a lot of suffering, of course, from these individuals. And then, of course, worse, and then you can see the actual suffering of teachers here, as often happens in these totalitarian movements. So take a moment, pause, and read. It's pretty chilling. And the rise of the Red Guards, especially, created some massive problems in Chinese society that we're going to talk about momentarily. The Red Guards, these young followers of Mao who were given free travel on the nation's rail networks and encouraged to go and sort of learn from creating revolution, led to more or less gangs of young people fighting in the streets of cities and the absolute collapse of the Chinese society and economy. These Red Guards would target, anyone they saw as an enemy, marginalizing and struggling teachers, sometimes parents, authority figures, anyone else who, they saw as opposing Mao's vision. Obviously, the chaos of the late Cultural Revolution could not last, and eventually the Red Guards fell from power. Mao acted in a really unique way by giving, for some reason, a group of workers and soldiers a mango. This mango had been given to him from the ambassador from Pakistan, I believe, and he had no interest in this mango, and so he re-gifted it to the soldiers, and this mango became sort of a symbol of Mao's support for the workers and the soldiers and his lack of support for the Red Guards. And so the workers went out and cleaned out the Red Guards and forced them back to their areas. Here's an awesome poem about how much the mango meant to the soldiers and the workers. And the Red Guards, in the end, were rounded up, sent to the countryside to be worked, to learn from the peasants. And the Cultural Revolution, at least the very violent part of it, came to an end. Despite the happy pictures, generally this was spectacularly traumatic for everyone involved, and the Cultural Revolution is generally viewed as a disaster by most outsiders. Although within China, I'm not going to get into public opinion within China. In the aftermath of this, as Mao was really losing influence, Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping targeted the Gang of Four and ended up bringing them up on charges. Once the Gang of Four fell from power, the Cultural Revolution mostly ended, and Zhou and Deng were clearly the sort of heirs apparent to Mao as he went into the last phases of his life. Mao, however, was absolutely not willing to hand power to Zhou and Deng, and Zhou actually declined, and Mao refused to allow him to go get treatment for his pancreatic cancer. And so Zhou Enlai died horribly from untreated cancer. But rather than appointing Deng as leader of communist China, because he was clearly sort of the rising voice within China, Mao instead gave power to Huo Guofeng, who famously basically said he would follow whatever Mao's policies were and was roundly mocked for his two whatever policies that you could see described here. And so, although Deng is not actually, and Mao's wife was put on trial, despite her claiming that Mao was just pushing her to do all these things, in the end she was found guilty and fell from power and influence. In the aftermath of this, as Mao died, Deng, despite not being the clear head of the Communist Party, became the clear leader, and he's really going to change the direction of China, as we're going to talk about in future lessons. So that's the end of the rise of China for today. We're going to return to talk about the reforms of Deng Xiaoping and how China's really going to change direction in the 1980s. But for now, thank you for listening.